Hello and welcome to the Ideas Factory. Once again, I'm Nagman. Joining me here on this discussion is Professor Harsh Pant, who's the Director of Strategic Studies at Observer Research Foundation. All of us, all the countries in the world, including India, are now moving towards an ease out of the lockdown. And as we are moving out of the lockdown, it's very interesting to look at how different countries and how the global leaders have dealt with the global pandemic. Maybe it's too early to analyze, but it's interesting to see how their relationship with each other, the different countries, their own domestic politics played a part or played a big role in their the decisions that they made to handle this global pandemic. So there are two things that we're going to look at in this episode. First is about the one that I just mentioned, how did different countries react to this global pandemic? And the second very important thing for India to look at now is what's happening in the Gulf countries, the GCC, the oil crisis, the falling oil demand and the prices. How is it going to affect India? It is going to affect India in a big way, in many ways. Harsh, I want to begin with the first point that I made, that we've seen. In fact, I read an article, I think by Chitra Subramanian, which had a very interesting caption that between a tweeting Trump and a smiling she stands a lady, Merkel. So how did Germany deal with this pandemic? And New Zealand, Ardern, how did she deal with it? What is different in the way they dealt with the crisis as compared to, say, a Bolsonaro or a Trump?
It's a fascinating question, and I think one that will be looked at, very, very seriously over the next few months and years. Because I think this is quite, we are already, as you point out, we are moving now from one stage of the crisis to another. We have seen one set of responses, and now we are in a phase where we will look at another set of responses from global leaders, because the crisis now is in various stages of, the lockdown is in various stages of being eased out. And clearly, different leaders will have to respond to a different set of economic circumstances now. The crisis, which was a health crisis in the first stage, is now moving into an economic crisis in the second stage. And it will be very interesting, again, to see how different leaders respond to that. But what has happened so far is equally fascinating. If you look at around the world, you mentioned two female leaders, which have been nothing short of outstanding in their own ways. And the way they have grappled with the situation, the way they have been very, very approached it with a sense of scientific temper, with a sense of rationality, with a sense of soothing calmness, which I think was which is so required in this crisis. And they have done it pretty well when it comes to their public perception. Now, one thing which I think needs to be said is that when there is a crisis, public generally tends to rally around the flag. So the leader, whoever is leading, or whoever is seen to be leading, generally gets very favorable responses, because people really like some authority to take over and manage that crisis. And I think we have seen, therefore, some rallying around the flag effect across the world where leaders have become popular. I think the exception perhaps being Mr. Trump, whose ratings clearly have not moved in either direction. So in that sense, he remains perhaps as polarizing as he was before this crisis struck America. But in some ways, what has happened in the case of Germany and New Zealand is that we have had two female leaders who have had a dramatic impact on the way they have approached the public very directly and very with facts, nothing to do with misinformation, not playing with this false sense of pride. There has been an acknowledgement that there is a real crisis, and some plain speaking with the public, which I think has been the hallmark of both Angela Merkel and the New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda. So I think we have seen that shift. We have seen that approach becoming very successful, being appreciated, at least so far. We have seen Germany and New Zealand also on way to recovery faster, perhaps, and done some great things with their health systems, managing this crisis, tiding over this crisis. And I think when we look back at this crisis a few months down the lane, we would look at these two leaders, and perhaps they'll become the leadership case studies in this time of Corona that perhaps many were looking at. But clearly, there are other. I know you have mentioned others, and I think it will be interesting to see what happens to Mr. Trump, Mr. Bolsonaro, and they have been, because they have been quite they have been quite extraordinary in their own ways, not challenging the conventional wisdom in some ways, challenging the conventional wisdom, not following the route that perhaps other leaders are taking. So in their own ways, they have also been, they have also broken some of the shibboleths, and I think, as we move forward, we would look back and we would assess them very, very differently.
Yes, Bolsonaro, for example, Bolsonaro, it was all about him, and it was all about his re-election in 2022. So it was all about his domestic politics. But a very interesting case study here is China. While all the countries, and we've discussed this in the earlier episode too, but China stands out while all the countries are right now struggling how to ignite their economy and how to get things back in order. China seems to be seizing every opportunity that COVID-19 has presented, and they say that beware of a more dynamic and a more innovative China. So what has China done differently, Harsh? When you look at the economy too, do you think because of the measures that they took in terms of long-term structural reforms, do you think China's economy is in a better position to absorb this shock, or maybe not, or maybe it's just a projection?
Well, I think, after the initial mishandling of the crisis by China, and it has been a quite dramatic shift in China's approach to this crisis. Once the leadership recognized that this crisis would almost pose an existential challenge to their authority domestically, they have been very nimble on their feet. And the kind of resources that they could bring to bear on this crisis, the kind of effort that they could organize around this crisis is quite extraordinary. And so when you have other countries now that look at two global powers like US and China, and they look at this muddled response of America, the Trump administration, and they compare it with China, many countries, many nations might be tempted to say that, look, Chinese model is much better. They have been able to mobilize resources much more effectively. They have been able to generate a mass program much more effectively. Yes, they continue to use information as a weapon. They continue to use this crisis for geopolitical influence. But there is no denying the fact that they domestically, at least, they have managed to convey. The Communist Party has been able to convey to the domestic population that Chinese Communist Party is on top of things, that Xi's leadership is what took them out of this crisis, even though, again, ironically, they were the ones who created the crisis in the first place. But now the narrative is completely shifted as far as the domestic opinion is concerned. And in some ways, this is what they are trying to convey, publicly as well. I mean, there is a fascinating story this week about how the diplomatic spat between Australia and China on issue where Australians have argued that there needs to be an independent inquiry on what actually happened in Wuhan and how this crisis originated. And Chinese were pushing back in ways that was quite undiplomatic, publicly, talking about what transpired in a private conversation between diplomats, pushing back very aggressively. So clearly, I think they want to change the narrative from one where China has been messing up the global health issues to one where China is now almost a savior. China has come out of this crisis well. They would demonstrate the fact that their production is back, their manufacturing is back on track, or at least trying to get back on track. They'll be much faster on the growth to economic recovery. And also, I think the larger narrative that China is quite capable of not only looking at its own problems, but also becoming a leader in its own right in the global firmament. So I think there is a real issue as far as China's leadership is concerned, which again we will be debating and discussing for a very, very long time, because in some ways China messed it up initially, but also in some ways it has managed to come back. I would not say with a bang, but managed to come back with a sense of purpose, which is again missing at this point from many other major powers.
Absolutely. There was also the whole politics about lockdown. For example, Sweden did not go for a complete lockdown, or the social distancing and many other things, but already in place because the population in general is pretty disciplined. So we've seen a different thing happening in Sweden. But let's just talk about the entire, the joblessness that it has created. The recent data, I think 30th April in America said that 1 out of 6 Americans is jobless right now. And here in India also, we are faced with a very high percentage of joblessness, pay cuts, all of that. So it's very interesting to look at the Gulf country because apparently about 9 million of the Indian diaspora is in the Gulf country, and a big percent of our GDP, 2% of our GDP is coming from the Gulf countries, the remittance that comes from there. And here in the Gulf countries, we've seen that there is a very low demand in oil, oil demand, and the prices have gone down. Then there is also a conflict between the oil producing countries with regard to the supply cut. So all of this together, we can say that the Gulf countries are caught in a storm, and that is going to affect India economically, commercially, as well as because of the diaspora that's there, and they will be also without jobs.
See, I think Gulf perhaps is one area that that will pass to one of the most phenomenal crises of our time. See, every country, every region is going through a crisis. But the crisis in Gulf is made up of multiple dimensions. It is not simply the fact that there is, the health pandemic has taken its toll. It's also a reality that most Gulf economies that rely on single source, on a single resource, are facing dramatic issues as the oil prices have come down. So multiple crises are shaping the reality of the Gulf at the moment. And there will be a political reaction, there will be a societal reaction, which we have been gradually trying to acknowledge. Now for India, this poses enormous challenges. And there is a reason why, if you look at the last few weeks, the level of engagement between the top leadership in India and top leadership in the Gulf has been very, very significant. Perhaps almost every week, either the Prime Minister is talking to the Gulf leaders or the External Affairs Ministers talking. Because it is very important for us, because of our diaspora, because of the remittances they send us, that the relationship remains on an even keel, that some of the untoward sentiments that are often betrayed or often revealed on the social media do not get, they do not become the sole driver of this relationship. There have been some tensions in recent weeks because of that. And I think it is imperative that the message from India remains one of solidarity with the Gulf, because not only because there is a larger bilateral national interest issue here at stake, but also because there is a larger crisis that once that crisis engulfs the Gulf, it will be very difficult for India to manage the consequences for its diaspora and the consequences for its economy. So clearly there is this is a relationship that needs to be the focus of our diplomatic and global engagement, and which I think is already happening, recognizing the challenges. But as you point out, the challenge is manifold. The challenge is, of course, that you have an oil crisis there. The prices are falling dramatically. You also now, on top of that, have a pandemic that these countries are having to, like much of the rest of the world, are having to encounter. So the reality is that the pressure on domestic politics will be huge. And now, I think this week there was a report that Oman is asking its companies to replace expats with domestic labor. Now, this is if this continues, then I think we need to be very clear that the impact on Indian labor, Indian economy, Indian diaspora is going to be very significant. So therefore, some level of engagement is necessary for that larger, longer goal that India has, that that economic and bilateral ties remain intact. But also the immediate problem, which I think India is facing, and now that we are talking of Indian workers who are stuck there, have to be treated well. Indian workers who are there, in terms of their health concerns, need to be taken into account. And so India has been regularly in touch with them, with the leaders of the Gulf, to make sure that Indian diaspora remains protected, its health concerns are taken into account. And that, I think, has been in some ways a consequence also of the major investment that Mr. Modi has done over the last 5 to 6 years in the Gulf, in its Gulf policy. So I think we will see, despite the turbulence, therefore, we have seen that the relationship remains on an even keel, and both sides are keen that the relationship remains like that, because there are far too many stakes that both sides have in this relationship.
Absolutely. And it's not just that 9 million Indians are stranded in the Gulf countries and their health is a concern, but also their jobs. We've seen that this oil problem there, or the falling oil demand, and the falling price, it's not just because of COVID-19, but like you pointed out, it's also because negotiation between OPEC and its allies, it just broke. And mainly because Russia was not agreeing to the cut in supply. So now that was there and the pandemic happened, already there were joblessness. Now we say that the oil price fall does not only mean that it is going to affect the economy of the Gulf countries, but it means that it is going to affect the Indian economy as well, because there will be layoffs. We had seen earlier, a couple of years back, that there were many suicides by the Indian diaspora, the people who were working there, the unskilled worker also. There's a huge proportion, a huge population there. So we're going to see all of that, the layoffs, like you pointed out. The priority is engaging the local population rather than giving jobs to the outsiders. Right now, there's a huge proportion of outsiders employed in their industry. So all that is also going to change.
Absolutely, and I think and India, I think, needs to look at this crisis as a pivotal moment, because in some ways this crisis is, as you point out, is not simply about the pandemic. It is about a larger structural change that is happening in the geoeconomics of the region, where the whole paradigm of an oil-based economy is coming to an end. Perhaps we are going to see major shift in that paradigm. And already before the COVID-19 pandemic came to our shores, we were witnessing this shift. We were witnessing the kind of turbulence that even societies like Saudi Arabia were facing. Now, the whole logic of Saudi Arabia's modernization had to do with the fact that it recognized that there is going to be a challenge as far as its reliance primarily on oil is concerned. So what we are looking at is a dramatic transformation in the geoeconomics of oil, of the Gulf, and therefore a fundamental transformation in geopolitics of the region. And India and Gulf relations will therefore have to navigate these waters. Now, as of now, of course, our concern is primarily that in India's labor force remains intact, protected, its health concerns remains taken care of. But beyond that, I think there needs to be a larger conversation with the Gulf countries as to what needs to be done in terms of remapping this relationship on the 21st century architecture, because clearly even today our relationship is largely based on oil. It's largely based on the way these economies, the Gulf economies, are shaped up. So what can we do to modernize this relationship? What can India contribute, and what can the Gulf countries contribute in Indian economy going forward? I think those are going to be the major challenges going forward beyond just the present pandemic.
So there's a huge change happening in the geoeconomics of the region. Thank you so much, Harsh, for that. And before we end this episode, I would just like to let our viewers know that there's a very interesting paper on this topic, which has been published at ORF. It's called Twin Crisis in the Gulf, Implications for India, by Annapurna Mitra and Riya Kastiwal. So if you're interested in the region, you can go through that paper. Thank you so much for joining us.